welcome to Dialogue. U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen recently said the U.S. is not trying to contain China and has called for resuming dialogue with Beijing. The U.S. side has also expressed opposition that it is decoupling from China, saying that would be mutually disastrous. What's behind this change of tone from the U.S.? Why is Washington now talking about engagement with Beijing halfway through the administration? If Washington truly seeks reconciliation with Beijing, what does it take to repair this seriously damaged relationship? To find out, I'm joined today by Zhao Hai, Director of International Political Studies at the National Institute for Global Strategy, Neysun Mahboubi, Research Scholar at the Center for the Study of Contemporary China at the University of Pennsylvania, and Sourabh Gupta, a resident senior fellow at the Institute for China-America Studies, and Liu Chang, assistant research fellow at the Department for American Studies of the China Institute of International Studies. That's our topic. I'm Xu Jinduo. Welcome to Dialogue. So the Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said the U.S. seeks a constructive and healthy economic relationship with China. Trade Representative Catherine Tai warned decoupling would be mutually disastrous. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, talked about the responsible approach in U.S.-China policy. So, Mr. Gupta, are we hearing a change of tone from Washington?
Yes, from Washington, certainly we are hearing a change of tone. This follows somewhat from the President Xi, President Biden meeting in Bali, where the two sides decided to have some sort of rapprochement. And of course, in February, the balloon incident threw everything a little bit off balance. And again, conversations between the two sides stopped. I think the US side wants to restart conversations, particularly on the economic and on the military track. But there is this question as to why this gung-ho enthusiasm to do so. And I think part of the reason is that for the first 2 years, the US has been doing all its sanctioning, economic punishment, technology controls, technology denials. It's got most of those done. There's still a little remaining to do. And therefore, now it would like to stabilize the economic relationship so that the Biden administration can win some economic gains going into its re-election campaign, and particularly at a time when the US economy doesn't seem to be doing too well, and we might even have a debt ceiling crisis later this summer. So I think those are some of the drivers behind these decisions.
Well, Zhao Hai, sitting in Beijing, how do you see the recent overture from the US side?
I think it's not credible at this point because the U.S. side has already stated their purpose, wanted to resume dialogue, just like Professor Gupta pointed out. However, from China's point of view, the U.S. side needs to present credible willingness to resume dialogue, which means that they cannot say something while doing other. They continue to try to suppress China, contain China. And also, even within Yellen's speech, she said that she predicted that the Biden administration will push out new measures against the outbound investment from the United States to China. So how can China trust that Yellen's speech conveyed a reconciliatory tone, trying to resume dialogue with China, while the U.S. doing something very different, continuing its hardline, tough stance against China? Not only in economic side, but also if you consider military security side, the U.S. had largest military drill with Philippines and also have a drill with South Korea. And in the next month, when the G7 meeting convey in Japan, they plan to do more against China. So in this very environment, it's very hard to believe that the U.S. side is ready to come back to the table and talk with China about pragmatic measures, including fighting against common global challenges. So again, I think Chinese side need clearer message from the U.S. side that they are actually serious about resuming talks with China.
Well, Neysun, do you think there is a seriousness in the tone from Washington that they are ready to resume dialogue and to engage with the Chinese side in a serious manner?
First of all, I really want to agree with Mr. Gupta's original point that What we're seeing now flows from that meeting between Presidents Biden and Xi Jinping in Bali. And really, in late January, early February, I think we were on track for the kind of messaging that we're seeing from the US side. And I think there was some receptivity on the Chinese side. And the balloon incident really, as he said, blew everything off course. It's very interesting that we are coming back to that after a few months of fallout and mutual maybe hurt feelings and recriminations over the balloon incident. So I think there is seriousness to Washington's messaging. I think it goes back to what the messaging was back in late January, early February. And I think it reflects something that is, I think, also true on the Chinese side, which is a recognition that whatever differences there are, and there are serious differences, we have to be careful that we don't have a spiral into something that is beyond any kind of guardrails. I think both sides want to see that kind of stability. And so I think the question now is whether the hurt feelings and all of that over the balloon incident have sufficiently subsided that both sides can get back to the kind of productive conversations we were expecting in early February.
Well, Liu Chang, what do you think the Chinese side is expecting out of the U.S. From Washington maybe to resume dialogue or routine dialogue between the two sides?
I think China has reassumed the conversation with Beijing's desire. But I think China is very calm for the desire because we think the Yellen's remarks release a very important signal, but kinds of lip service, I think, to let us know that he has this desire. But I think I want to second Mr. Zhao Hai that the Biden administration believes the logics about do something and say something and do something else. So it's very hard for Beijing to believe that Washington has very true intentions to communicate with China. And the other question is, what the purpose of the communication between the China and the United States? What kinds of the communication can be doing something to improve something like the international global challenges? So this is the questions we should discuss more details. And I think this in this very moment, I think the signals from the Washington D.C. is not enough to ensure the Chinese confidence.
Well, that seems to be an interesting point. Like even if the two sides resume dialogue, what they are going to talk about. But before that, let's take a listen, at Yellen, who said that the U.S. does not seek to decouple the U.S. economy from China. Let's take a look here.
The United States will assert ourselves when our vital interests are at stake, but we do not seek to decouple our economy from China's. A full separation of our economies would be disastrous for both countries. It would be destabilizing for the rest of the world. Rather, we know that the health of the Chinese and U.S. economies is closely linked. A growing China that plays by the rules can be beneficial for the United States.
Well, Mr. Gupta, I think most of the people would agree with, Janet Yellen that the two economies are closely linked and they can benefit from the exchanges and trade and investment in each other or with each other. But does, her remark or her view represent a unified view, inside the Biden administration?
Yes, up to a point, I would actually say so, that she has the more liberal view in the Biden administration, the Treasury Department, while National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan is the representative of the more hawkish view. And I would have said in the first 2 years, it was Jake Sullivan who was winning those battles. And in fact, it was Jake Sullivan who trundled Janet Yellen out last year and talked about French shoring. Let's do French shoring, which is about resilience of supply chains, but it is also about, up to a certain extent, decoupling from China, frankly, and not just about de-risking supply chains. But I would say that from this beginning of this year, Ms. Yellen has had the upper hand on Jake Sullivan. It's a difference of nuance. So there is more or less, I would say, a degree of unity within the administration on where it's going. And I would say, and furthermore, Mr. Sullivan is going to be making an important speech very soon too on these matters. So we will see if there really is unity or not. But my fundamental point out here is she says we don't want to decouple, and that's understandable. And the US is not trying to fully decouple, but it is selectively decoupling. And that what is selective is getting broader and broader and broader. And these are not only being done just for national security reasons, but these are being done for an unfair economic competitiveness reasons. And the Treasury Department itself, in terms of its electric vehicle tax credits, et cetera, is part of doing that unfair economic competition vis-a-vis China. And that's why her speech, I thought, to some extent lacked credence.
Mm-hmm. Well, Neysun, earlier we mentioned about let's assume there is a discussion, there's a resumption of dialogue between Beijing and Washington. So what they will talk about, we know they are not going to talk about the shift of the global supply chain away from China. That's efforts from Washington. They're not going to talk about the export of chips because the U.S. has a ban on advanced chips export to the Chinese side. So what are they going to talk about?
I think a lot of the agenda is still the agenda that would have been if Secretary Blinken had gone to Beijing back in early February. Certainly, very high on the agenda is talking about the war in Ukraine, and at least from the U.S. side, to try to make sure that U.S. and China are roughly on the same page about some kind of lines that are very important to the U.S. In that regard. I think certainly setting up some discussion of the contours of the Taiwan issue is going to be very important for both sides, as we've seen that take on a lot more valence in recent months and years. But then beyond that, I think there could be a lot of productive discussion on just kind of getting engagement of business and scholars like myself going back and forth across the two borders. I think there's a lot of very kind of practical but important things like getting the visas processing streamlined, getting the flights. I don't know if any of you have looked at flights between the US and China lately, but they're still extremely expensive and very inconvenient routing because they haven't brought all the routes back. So there's a lot of very kind of small things like that that may not seem of geopolitical importance, but they are a way of getting the relationship stabilized with that people-to-people exchange that has been such a ballast for the relationship for so many years. So maybe it's not the most comprehensive set of issues, but it's enough to do something productive. And I think the sooner that those kinds of issues can be addressed in a face-to-face way, I think the better.
Well, Zhao Hai, of course, there are a lot of, let's say, detailed or specific issues, more on technical, side, to be discussed between the two sides, like flights. But what about the geopolitical issues, like Taiwan, like the U.S. containment of China? What's if there's an agenda, what's the Chinese agenda to talk with the U.S.?
Well, there's a lot on the agenda if the U.S. side is open to discuss these issues. However, it seems to us that the U.S. has made up its mind on a lot of those issues, and they don't want to give an inch on those issues because of the domestic pressure, their domestic competition for toughness against China. I wanted to emphasize one point, though. Looking at Yellen's remarks, the venue is very important, very interesting because Yellen chose the Johns Hopkins SAIS school, and she talked about Johns Hopkins Nanjing Center, which I graduated from. It's a symbol for China-U.S. cooperation, people-to-people exchanges in the early years in the 1980s. So I think that's a symbolism for Yellen to show that she's willing to have the dialogue resumed and people-to-people exchange resumed. However, I think if you look at the Western media reporting that remark, her speech is very interesting because they have two kinds of titles. One emphasized that Yellen said economic is taking more priority than economics, and the U.S. is willing to take any burden or any cost in order to protect its national security. Other media would report that Yellen emphasize, for instance, that U.S. has no intention of decoupling, has no intention of containing China, preventing China from economic growth. That means that exactly these two logics are contained in one speech, and those logics are fighting with each other. So the U.S. side has not think this through, whether or not they wanted to engage with China and clarify its national security boundaries, or they wanted to actually pursue an overall grand strategy to contain China regardless of economic cost. So before the US side actually make up their mind, it's hard to talk about just the details because yes, of course, we can talk about visas, flights, we can talk about the Taiwan issue for de-escalation. There are many, or establishing sort of a crisis dialogue communication lines, but without making sure that Biden administration is true to their words. For instance, they don't want to pursue a Cold War with China. They don't want to, actually suppressing China's technological advance. Like Yellen said, that they don't want to take economic advantage, just wanted to protect their national security. Fine, let's talk about those parameters. But at this point, I don't think that the US side is willing to talk about those issues. And therefore, even if we resume dialogue, what can we talk about? That's fundamentally Chinese side suspicion.
Mm-hmm. So Neysun, your turn, do you think there is a clear boundary in terms of U.S. national security? And Ms. Yellen, she did talk about, the U.S. is ready to sacrifice economic interests for the sake of national security interests. But then, what are those interests? It seems to be quite expensive,
I think my general perspective on this is that, first of all, I think it is completely implausible that the US and China, the two largest economies in the world, deeply intertwined in so many different ways, would actually go to some kind of real conflict. I think it's completely implausible. And I think reasonable people on both sides understand that. And so there is going to be ultimately some way that stabilizes the spiral of the relationship. But I think as we go to that process of stabilizing it, both sides have this idea in their minds of wanting to negotiate from what they call a position of strength. So both sides have this kind of idea that before they go into the stabilization discussion, they want to feel like they have set themselves up in a, quote, position of strength. And, at some point, you just need to stabilize the relationship. So I think on both sides, the voices that say, look, it's time to stabilize things seem to be a little bit more ascendant right now. But of course, we know that the domestic politics on both sides are still exercising an influence, and there are hawkish voices on both sides. So it's not necessarily a smooth ride. I do think, though, that the signals we're seeing from the Yellen speech and also a little bit from Beijing indicate that one way or another, we're going to get to the place where the two sides can work out some of the guardrails they need to on these really difficult issues.
Mm-hmm. Zhao Hai, if picking up of what Neysun mentioned about speaking from a position of strength. I mean, China is not really on a weaker position now. I mean, China, if you look at the sort of decline of the U.S. dollar, for example, countries are seeking alternative to U.S. dollars, and also 19 countries are waiting to join the BRICS group. And China's successful negotiation, bringing Saudis and Iranians together, China is not in a weaker position. There's no lack of confidence in speaking to the Americans, right?
Yeah, I think when the US side is saying that they want to speak from the position of strength, that means that they're not currently speaking from the position of strength. They have a deep worry that they've lost that strength. And I think Yellen wanted to stress that point. She said in her speech that the U.S. economy is still very strong, and in the future, comparing to possible declining China growth rate, the U.S. will maintain its leadership, global economic leadership, and therefore the U.S. wanted to regain that kind of confidence. I want to emphasize that between the dialogue, between China-U.S. dialogue, Chinese side never seek speaking to the U.S. side from a position of strength. We want mutual respect. We want equality or equal position to talk with each other, not talking down by the U.S. But the U.S. wanted to maintain its hegemony, wanted to asking China to comply to its rules-based international order, or whatever you call it. So I think that's why China always feels uncomfortable when the U.S. side is trying to communicate with China, but setting that precondition that China needs to recognize and abide by the rules set by the U.S. side. So again, I think communication is perfectly fine. But just like the beginning of the Trump administration, when they talk to the Chinese side, they say, "Oh, pure dialogue doesn't mean anything. We need a result-oriented diplomacy against China." Right now, China is returning that to the U.S. side, saying we want some results before we can resume dialogues, because just talking to each other seems to, particularly talking to the Biden administration, seems to move us nowhere. Mm-hmm. So again, I think in the near future, I hope that two sides will resume dialogue, because we're in a very dangerous place without talking to each other, particularly military to military. But again, the U.S. side needs to reestablish that trust with China. And also, I think in the very near future, to at least establish some kind of a buffer within its domestic politics, not interfered by its, for instance, congressional hawkish representatives against China, so that the Biden administration will have some independence in terms of making its China policy.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Gupta, speaking of that, Joe Biden has announced its bid for the second term of the presidential term over there. I mean, how will that, or how might that affect this relationship? Because obviously, I expect the candidates will be competing to show who is more hawkish on their China policy.
Yeah, absolutely correct on that front. And I think what Mr. Biden is trying to do is trying to be hawkish enough, but not too hawkish, because then the bilateral relationship will spin out of control, and that would actually play in favor of the Republicans. So he's trying to be moderately hawkish, but still manage issues. And part of the reason I think he is trying to become much more friendlier on the economic front is because I think they would love to have another phase one type of economic agreement, where there are market purchases by the Chinese government or by China in the ag sector, natural gas, et cetera, which he can then show to his constituents that, look, we are exporting out, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, there's the other nearer term issue where I think Ms. Yellen wants to reassure the Chinese side that even in a debt ceiling crisis, that the US will honor its payments on Treasury bonds to China. So that's also in the conversation. But you're absolutely correct. I mean, this is all wrapped up in politics, in domestic politics. And as we've seen in first-term Democratic administrations, they're always a bit craven in terms of their outreach to China. Think of Clinton 1, Obama 1. The US-China relations were very different at that point of time, but there was always a little hesitation of going too far out in trying to have engagement with China. And yet, Clinton 2 and Obama 2 were incredibly warm in terms of the US-China relationship. And so we'll have to see who gets reelected in 2024. But domestic politics is framing US policy and its outreach and its hawkishness, frankly, towards China.
Mm-hmm. So, Zhao Hai, if you look at possible discussion between the two sides, obviously the U.S. Would love to seek some Chinese purchase more U.S. export agricultural products, for example, and probably continue to purchase U.S. Treasury bonds, for example. But is China ready to do that, to cooperate with the U.S. side?
Well, Chinese side is always ready to cooperate with the U.S. side. Actually, in the beginning of the Biden administration, we extended the offer to continue negotiation, the next phase deal with the U.S. side. The Biden administration chose not to because they don't think that the Trump administration's phase one trade deal is a good deal. However, they don't have a plan to talk to China and make the second phase or a new deal with China. So at this point, I would say that the U.S. plan is to build a different trading group with its allies and partners, while putting relations with China in terms of trade and investment on the back burner. On the front line, the only thing that they're willing to do is to curb investment and trade with China and move those trade and investment to other places like friendshoring or reshoring or nearshoring, whatever you call it. So at this point, I think if the U.S. side is willing to talk with China, of course, we can talk a lot of things because Chinese has a huge demand for U.S. Products, including agriculture, energy, service, and industrial, like airplanes, cars. So there's a huge potential. It's just that whether or not some of Americans think that trade relationship is harmful in terms of national security or is actually beneficial to U.S. development, that's a question. From Chinese side, again, if they wanted to talk about trade, fine. We have BIT still on the table a long time ago. And also we can talk about other things, including, China is self-promoting, self-propelling to open up our own market this year. And if you look at what happened in Hainan and other free trade zones and also other trade deals that China is right now negotiating or applying to join to, there are many potential market space for the US goods. So again, I don't think that's a barrier. The barrier is still whether or not politics are intervened in this scheme.
Mr. Gupta, if there is a discussion between the two sides, obviously negotiation, that is a process of give and take. Is there anything the U.S. is ready to give before talk about what they can take from the Chinese side?
It's a good question and hard to see because, in the months going forward, we are going to be seeing an outbound investment screening mechanism. That's not going to make China happy. It's winding its way through Congress, something called the Restrict Act, which will give the Commerce Secretary the ability to essentially ban TikTok and WeChat. It doesn't mean that she necessarily will, but it will give her the authority to do that. Again, that's not going to make China happy. Catherine Tai has not moved at all on the Section 301 tariffs as yet. It's still in the process of deliberation. And therefore, the US has to think in these areas what it can do. I know, as I've mentioned, Treasury Secretary Yellen saying that we will honor our treasuries, which we owe regardless of the debt crisis issue. But there has to be more on the table that the US puts. And I'm not sure what's there on the table to put, except to suggest that we want to stabilize the relationship from a political standpoint and make it economically beneficial up to a point. That sounds good, but I think there needs to be more on the table, and particularly in this context of developing trust. If we are going to have, as I said, the screening mechanism, the Restrict Act, or frankly, when one of the cabinet secretaries travel to Beijing, the US releases the balloon report. Those can all be trust busters. And so we'll have to see how we can manage the relationship delicately going forward.
Well, with that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there. To see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you. All around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.